Hello and welcome back to another edition of the Jacob and Jacob podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Hare. Unfortunately, my co-host, Jacob Boban, was unable to join us today, but as we are lucky to be joined by NBA insider Brian Windhorst. Thanks for being with us today, Brian.
No problem. How are you, good man?
Good, how are you? Good morning. Yep.
It is a good morning. This is very early in the morning. I'm very impressed that you get up and do this before you have to go to um to school. I would not. I didn't do anything when I was your age before I went to school.
Yeah, that's one of the benefits of online school that we have the time to do this.
Right.
So, you've been covering basketball for almost 2 decades. Can you explain why you decided to get into the basketball world?
What year were you born, Jacob?
2003.
So that was the first year I covered the NBA. So that puts it in perspective, right?
Yeah.
Um, when I was a kid, I was really into sports, but I wasn't really that talented in sports.
Mhm.
Um, I wasn't tall, I wasn't fast. I had good hands. I could have been a receiver because I had really good hands, but I couldn't get open because I was slow. So that was no good. I was an okay golfer, but certainly nothing to be good at, to be excited about.
Mhm.
So I really wanted to work in the sports industry, and I wasn't sure where it would be. Um, I didn't want to be honest with you, I didn't want to have a go into an office 9 to 5 life. That was an important thing to me. And there's a lot of different jobs like that now where you don't have that. It wasn't necessarily the case back then. I mean, uh, so I felt like that was a way I could do it. Plus, I love to travel.
Mhm.
I really wanted to have a job in sports where I traveled. And guess what? Sports teams travel, especially pro sports teams. So anyway, I decided to go into. I did like writing, so I decided to go into journalism and be a reporter. And I started working for a newspaper, my local newspaper in Akron, Ohio, when I was actually 16 years old. And I worked at that newspaper through high school and college. And when I got out of college, I got lucky enough to get a full time job there. And I didn't know what I was going to cover. When I first started doing it, I was covering all sports. I was covering high school wrestling and um, college volleyball and stuff like that. But luckily, when I was a few years into my career, there was this other kid from Akron, Ohio, who was 14 at the time when I met him, named LeBron James.
I've heard of him.
So I was just very fortunate, and I covered him throughout high school. And I was just very, very lucky that when he came to the NBA, he went to the local team, which was the Cleveland Cavaliers, and uh, the job covering the Cleveland Cavaliers was open. So I was very lucky when I was 25 in 2003 that I started to cover the NBA. And so now it's been 18 years. So you must be about 18, Jacob, because that must be 17 and a half or something, because that's
Yeah.
when I started covering the NBA.
So, can you tell me how you ended up at ESPN, going from the local newspaper and maybe another few stops on the way to the biggest sports broadcasting business in the world?
Yeah. So when I was probably had been doing the job for 3 or 4 years, ESPN had an opening
Mhm.
for a national NBA reporter. I was really not qualified at all to apply for that job. This was in about 2006, maybe. But I went up there and interviewed, Bristol, Connecticut, my first time ever there. And um, it was kind of clear I wasn't going to get the job. But I told them, and this is actually, I hate to be all like, here's a lesson, young man. But I told them, if you guys ever need, stories on LeBron, for ESPN.com, I could maybe do some for you. And so the people that I talked to there, the editors, were like, okay, maybe. And, and that was like in the summer. I want to say that was in like June or July. And they hired somebody by the fall. And, I never even heard back from them, to be honest with you. But midway through the next season, I think it was in January, I had a story idea and I emailed them and said, hey, what do you think about this story idea? And they liked it. And so, I don't know if they 100% trusted me yet, but I wrote a story for them. And my first ESPN story as a freelancer, as like just a one-off. I don't remember what they paid me for it, like maybe $150. And that was where it started. And so I I did another one and another one, and then the playoffs came around, and they were like, "Well, we don't necessarily need to send a reporter to cover this Bucks Cavs first round playoff series. Maybe you could write some stories for us in addition to your normal newspaper stuff." And that meant doing a lot of work, Jacob, because like these games would end. Like a playoff game would end at like they start at 8 o'clock, and a playoff game would end about 10:30.
Yeah.
And by the time you go do the interviews and you write your story for the newspaper, it would be about midnight, and everybody would be packing up and going home. But then I would sit there and write a second story, or some cases a third story, depending on what my requirements were for ESPN. Because ESPN, they didn't have a deadline like a newspaper that had to print the newspaper. And so I was would do that for several years. Would do extra stories for ESPN on top of my newspaper work. And it meant that I was leaving the arenas pretty late, 1, 2 in the morning. And like they were paying me for them, don't get me wrong. Like I was getting money out of it, but it wasn't like enough money to like go buy a new car. Um, so I did that for 4 years, more and more and more and more. And so when LeBron moved to Miami in 2010, ESPN didn't have anybody in Miami, and they thought that that was a pretty big job,
Mhm.
someone to do that. And I had a 4-year relationship with them by then. And this was, they had told me, you're not ready to work for us, which I wasn't, Jacob.
Yeah.
But then 4 years later, I was, and I had this relationship with them that I put in all this extra work. So actually, I knew. So 2010, you probably don't remember because you were 7, but that was that was the summer where LeBron moved to Miami, and I knew that that was going to be a really heavy workload summer for me. So my best friend and I scheduled a vacation after the free agency, and I was actually in Thailand,
Mhm.
and I was next going to Australia. And ESPN my editor at ESPN called me and said, "Hey, we need to have a talk with you." And we had the interview. I mean, interview wasn't much of an interview. I mean, they knew me pretty well. I mean, I had literally probably done 100 stories for them by then.
So like the
But
official interview.
yeah, was over Skype within my hotel room at like 1 a.m. or midnight in Thailand. Um, and they said, "We want you to move to Miami." So I think I accepted the job while I was in Australia,
Mhm.
because that was where I went next. So yeah, so that was 10 years ago. So, or, coming up on 11. So, I started working for ESPN. That's how I got there. And, when I got there, it was like, you're writing for ESPN.com, and that's it. I never even talked to the television people at all. They didn't know who I was practically. So it's all been a process. But now, 18 years covering the NBA, and 11 of them are, 10 plus at ESPN.
All right. So fast forwarding to 2021,
Mhm.
right now the NBA trade deadline's coming up in a little bit over a month. Can you tell us some players who might be on the move and some teams who might be some buyers and sellers?
It's interesting that you asked me that, Jacob, because when I talk to the NBA teams every single day, these are the same questions that they're asking themselves. They don't know who the buyers and sellers are. And that's a question that happens every year about this time, about a month before the deadline,
Mhm.
which teams are going to be willing to trade players, which teams want to trade for players. This year is particularly difficult because so many teams are bunched in at the center.
Mhm.
I haven't looked at the standings right this morning, but I know yesterday there was 11 teams that were within 3 games of 500. And last year, about this point in the season, there were 3. So what you're getting there is you have a whole bunch of teams that are on the fence. Are we good or are we bad? And then you have the fact that 20 teams are going to quote unquote make the playoffs this year
Yeah, with the playing game.
because the play-in tournament. So more teams kind of make the playoffs, and more teams are bunched together. So as a result, you have more teams that don't know whether they're buying or selling. So I actually think it's going to be a seller's market. It's going to favor the teams who are willing to trade people. because there's not going to be many of them. And uh, will there be a big name or two who comes on the market? So one of the names people are wondering about right now, for example, is Kyle Lowry. You know, the Raptors 3 days ago were one game over 500. Today, I think they're one game under 500. Do they trade Kyle Lowry or do they keep him? If they trade him, you know, it's a huge player on the market, but we don't know. I don't. They probably don't know. He's also kind of like Mr. Raptor, you know.
Yeah.
The Orlando Magic are they've been decimated by injuries. Um, I think they're maybe willing to trade some of their players, maybe Aaron Gordon, maybe Evan Fournier. Are those types of players guys that are franchise changing players? I don't know. And then you have players that you know are available, guys like Andre Drummond and Blake Griffin, who are big names, but again, I don't know if they're going to change the fortunes of a franchise. So we will definitely see trades, but I think we won't really know what the market is because the deadline is March 25th.
Mhm.
We really may not know who's fully available until like March 18th or 20th or something, where teams start to decide, all right, this team's going nowhere. We're going to dump. And there might be teams that are like, you know what? We think we can do something with this team. Let's go make a trade, you know? And there's certain teams that we thought were certainly going to be sellers who have turned into buyers. Like, let me give you an example. The Knicks.
Yeah.
You know, the Knicks were a team that we thought might be selling. Well, they've made a trade already to add Derrick Rose.
Mhm.
So you're in the Philly area, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
So Philly, you know, they're definitely going to be a buyer. Like if Kyle Lowry becomes available, that's a player that's very interesting, I would think, to Philadelphia.
Just because of the
Um,
Nova connection.
well, yeah, I mean the thing is, you know, Kyle's going to be a free agent,
Yeah.
and you know, uh, you don't want to trade a lot of stuff for him unless you think you can keep him.
Mhm.
Well, Philly is home for him, so you know he may want to stay there. So you may be willing to trade more, you know, because you can know you might be able to keep him in free agency. Um, but I'm sure there's gonna be other teams who want to bid for him. But Philly for Kyle would be a fascinating team because he would fit really nicely alongside Ben Simmons. They could play together. Um, and there's some pieces. First off, the Sixers have their draft pick they could trade, and they also have some. They have guys like Mike Scott and Danny Green who could be in a trade like that. But again, we're talking about Mr. Raptor. He is probably the most. I know Kawhi Leonard is the MVP, the Finals MVP, but like Mr. Raptor is Kyle Lowry. So that's not an easy thing to do. And the Raptors, are still competitive. So we'll see. But that'd be. I'm sure in the Philadelphia market that will be something that's talked about a lot over the next month.
Yeah, I was listening to talk radio yesterday morning, right after the Raptors Sixers game, and they were saying that in the last 2 minutes of the game, there was no one who could handle the ball and just control the end of the game. And Kyle Lowry is the perfect guy to come to Philly, do that, and add that dynamic that the Sixers have honestly been missing for almost a decade now with the primary ball handler. Because look, don't get me wrong, Simmons is great, but he can't shoot in the final 2 minutes of a game, so his impact isn't there.
Yeah, he's also a great defensive player. He's also a veteran. You
Yeah.
know, he's there'd be a lot going for him. But if he becomes available, but because there would be nobody else on the market, there would be like almost like a bidding war for him. But like I said, Philly does have their draft pick they could trade this year, um, and they have a couple of other options that they could make a move for. So it could get interesting if that does happen.
All right, so sticking with Philly, do you believe that Philly will come out of the East, and who do you believe will come out of the West? And if Philly's not coming out of the East, which team do you think will?
Well, Brooklyn has been extremely impressive to me. I mean, that's not a hot take, obviously, but when they first came together, I wasn't sure how they were going to go, and I also thought that their defense was going to really hold them back. Well, a couple of things. One, Kyrie and Harden specifically. I wasn't worried about Durant. Durant is so talented and can do so many things and has yielded his game in the past. He has yielded to Westbrook. He has yielded out there to Golden State. I was not worried at all about Durant fitting in, and he hasn't even played that much, but I'm not worried about him. I was worried about Kyrie and Harden because both of those guys are guys that have had difficulty with teammates in the past.
Yeah.
And so I was not, I know there were people who were saying, this is the greatest triumvirate in the history of the game, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, let's just wait and see if they can stand each other, you know? And I still am saying wait and see if they can stand each other because Kyrie's mood swaps pretty easily. So I think that's the biggest variable is where's Kyrie's head at when we get to the playoffs. But Kyrie and Harden have worked very well together, and they have both made sacrifices to try to help the other one. And I've been impressed with that. I've been very, very impressed with the way Harden has played. He's not hunting for fouls like he used to. He recognizes that Kyrie's role was being threatened by his arrival.
Mhm.
And so he has purposely like tried to let Kyrie breathe and have the ball. I mean, there have been games that I've watched where I feel like Harden should go over there and grab the ball from Kyrie and say, I'm doing this. But he let Kyrie have it because he knows Kyrie's kind of got to cook. And Kyrie responded by saying, you know what, you are the point guard. You can handle it. And that sounds obvious, like no kidding, the guy's an MVP point guard. But remember, Kyrie left Cleveland because he didn't want to play with a guy. I mean, LeBron and Harden aren't exactly alike, but they're similar. And he didn't like that. And he's like, I'm getting out of here. So they have been very impressive to me. So you'd say, well, defensively, they can't stop anybody. That's a fair point. In today's NBA, we've never seen an offensive season like we're seeing this year. Um, of all of the NBA seasons in the history of the league, 74 years, 8 of the top 12 offensive seasons by team are happening this year. The top 4 offensive seasons of all time are happening right now, and 8 of the top 12. So, I mean, there are teams, Jacob, there are teams almost every single night that are shooting over 50% and losing by double digits.
Mhm.
I think, I don't know when you're putting out this podcast, but last night it happened with Detroit. Detroit shot 54% against New Orleans and lost by 10. I don't know the number on it, but I would bet that the winning percentage before this season for a team that shot 54% in a game was somewhere in the high 80s to 90s, where you would shoot that high. I mean, maybe you only do it once or twice a season, and you would always win those games. Teams used to, the absolute top teams in the league used to average like 44, 45% shooting. Now, if you shoot 44%, you're getting blown out. So maybe then this year in 2020, 2021, maybe defense isn't going to matter. Now, the old school NBA dudes would say to you, well, in the playoffs, it'll matter. And I think it probably will. But this might be the year for some team that plays all offense to just win with straight gas. And so that is what, if you're a Sixer fan, that's what you've got to worry about. So normally, in a normal year, I would say, well, look, Embiid is playing an MVP level season. The Nets have nobody to even begin to sniff being able to deal with him. In a playoff series, Embiid, if he was healthy, might average 38 points against the Nets, and that would be a deal breaker. That may happen. The Nets still might be able to win because they may be able to just survive without it. So it's an arms race, and so that's another reason why, if you're Philly, you're saying, is there another player that we can get to help us in this arms race? Because that's what it may come down to. I think those are the 2 teams in the East for sure. And in the West, when Anthony Davis and LeBron James are healthy and the Lakers are defending, I still think they can be the best team. But you're talking about things that are not true right now, and right now the Lakers are in a slump offensively. So we'll see. But I would be hard to bet against those 2 guys in the long run.
On a scale of 1 to 10 right now, how concerned are you about the Lakers?
I'm not that concerned because the Anthony Davis is hurt. The other thing is the Lakers they have a trump card that other teams don't. And so the Lakers have two pretty significant weaknesses. One is that their center position is weak defensively.
Mhm.
Their center position was very strong defensively last year, and they changed their identity a little bit when they traded JaVale McGee and they let Dwight Howard go. Those, whatever you want to say about those guys, they were super athletic and they blocked shots at the rim, and we knew every night they were going to defend at the rim. That's not the case with the Lakers this year, even though they're a good defensive team. So their defensive at center is a problem, but the trump card is they can put Anthony Davis at center. They have this top 10 NBA player that they can say, oh, we'll just turn the lineup this way and he can play center. And that all of a sudden solves the problem. He doesn't want to do that in February. He doesn't want to do it in April, but when it matters, he will do it. And that is a beast. Their other big problem is that they are a very spotty, shaky outside shooting team. This is something that I thought was going to undercut them last year in the Orlando bubble. And ultimately they did not. Ultimately, they got the shooting when they needed it. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, for example, got really hot. And so in this offensive season where all these guys are making shots, especially when you see the Jazz out there, who are just one of the greatest three-point shooting teams of all time, if they may end up being the greatest three-point shooting team of all time. They played last night, the Lakers and Jazz. The Jazz made 22 threes. The Lakers made 8. I am not a math major, but I don't think you can win a game where one team makes 22 threes and the other team makes 8. But can the Jazz make 22 threes in the Western Conference Finals? Maybe they can. I don't know. So I definitely think that the Lakers are wounded, but I would just say in general, be careful looking at the way a LeBron James team is performing in the regular season and assuming that it won't be better in the postseason. Because I want to point out that the last 9 times LeBron has been in the playoffs with 3 different teams, he's gone to the finals. I know that he was injured and they missed that one year, but the last 9 times they've been in the playoffs, he's gone to the finals. So yeah, he's older, but just keep that in mind when you think about making your predictions.
So before I let you go, I have one last question for you.
Yeah.
Who is going to take home the NBA MVP? It's a question we discuss all year and analyze, but
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting since sports betting is so prevalent now, and we can watch the odds change.
it's like every
You
night.
know, so ESPN did a poll 2.5 weeks ago where we asked 100 people who would likely vote for the MVP, who would win, and we do that a couple times a year, and it's a very good poll. It's not like asking people's opinions.
Mhm.
It's asking the people who actually probably are going to vote, which way they're going to vote. And it's been very predictive. We've done it for 3 years now. It's been pretty much predictive of who's going to win the MVP. So here's a little tip out there for you. If you want to bet, when we do that poll again, like in the second half of the year, probably, it'll probably be about in May. Whoever wins that poll, I mean, the odds will probably not be as good as favorable, but whoever wins that poll, sports bettors, might be a good idea to pay attention to that because again, it's not someone's opinion; it's the actual voters, and there's only 100 voters. Okay, it's not like the the national election where you're polling 1/1000% of the electorate. You're basically polling the electorate.
Yeah.
That poll had LeBron at over 50% of the vote. So LeBron was in the lead. And I felt that with Anthony Davis out for a month, the lane was open for LeBron to kind of solidify the award, because if the Lakers had gone off on this, had kept winning, and instead of being, I think they were 1-5 without Anthony, if they were 5-1, and like let's say at the end of it they went like 9-3 or something like that, and like they were right on the Jazz's heels for the number 1 record, or if they, I would have felt like, man, LeBron has really grabbed it by the throat. Well, that hasn't happened. Even though LeBron's put up good numbers, he's actually not shooting that well from the outside. But LeBron's actually put up pretty good numbers. But his team is losing. And so I think it's really wide open now. So I think Embiid is up there. I want to point out that the last time a true center, won the MVP. It was before you were born, Jacob. It was Shaq, and I think in 2000 or 2001.
Mhm.
So it's been 20 years since a center. So that's just the difficulty that Embiid is dealing with.
Yeah.
And you talk about people like Damian Lillard, but again, if you look over the last 20 years, um, the MVP has come from one of the top 3 or 4 teams in the league, like 18 out of 20 years.
Mhm.
Um, it's really hard to win the MVP award. No, because like for example, Steph Curry's numbers this year are almost identical to his numbers the year that he won unanimous MVP. And so you'd say, my gosh, well, why wouldn't he be the leading candidate for MVP? And the answer is because in 2016 his team was 73-9,
Yeah.
and this year's team's 500. And
Yeah.
it doesn't mean he's having a lesser season, but winning is a huge component of the MVP year after year after year after year. And you could pour out all of these reasons why it shouldn't be, and and all you could write a paper or do a PowerPoint presentation on why that shouldn't be the case, and the Dame should win it, and that would all be compelling. But I'm just going to tell you, as an MVP voter, it's kind of like the Oscars. Some years, like a certain movie just gets all the Oscars. Like it gets best actor and best supporting actor and best sound editing, everything like that. And you can look at it and say, well, wait a minute, this director has made 6 great movies. Why is it this movie that's winning all the Oscars? And this other movie didn't win any Oscars. And the answer is because sometimes it's just that person's time. And I wish it was more analytical than that. But and the voters tend to focus on a team and say, this is this team and this person's time. And so you really sort of need that part of your MVP case. And so my guess would be that it would be on a team that's one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the league, and a non-center. So that still points to LeBron.
Yeah.
And especially since he hasn't won it in 8 years. So it's right there for LeBron to win it. But the Lakers are going to have to get back to winning at some point for that to happen.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining the podcast today, and hopefully we'll find out the NBA soon, or the MVP soon enough.
All right, man. Thank you for having me, and good luck with everything in your future.